Hi, my name is Dina Plemmons. I'm the director of the Research Ethics Education Program at UC Riverside. And we're going to talk today about what research ethics is and why the consideration of ethical issues in research and scholarship is essential to conducting good research. These concerns of research ethics or scientific integrity or the responsible conduct of research, different terms for essentially the same arena, speak to the issues that are part of learning to become an ethical professional. In addition to learning the science, the theory, techniques, methods, and the body of literature that make up your discipline, as a student, you are also expected to learn how to interact with others while learning and doing that science. You interact with your peers, your mentors, your PI, other faculty, other colleagues, perhaps research participants, perhaps animal subjects, and you interact with all of these people around specific practices such as authorship, peer review, and data management. Research ethics then addresses the ethical issues of being a scientist, in addition to the ethical questions raised by science. I especially like how one of my colleagues talks about research ethics. It is, in some instances, an examination of ethical issues connected to how scientific knowledge is built, while in other instances it involves ethical implications of how scientific knowledge is applied. These ethical issues are contextualized, of course, in the specifics of a particular field of research, but also, and in some ways more importantly, in shared values and obligations we all have as researchers and scholars in our various communities of practice. So what are those shared values? We broadly, as good researchers, will conduct research honestly, accurately, efficiently, and objectively. We know, commonsensically, not to steal, cheat, or lie in the conduct of our research. And there are some obligations that we all have, no matter our discipline or field of research. We have very basic and fundamental obligations to the research itself. This means many things. We must keep sufficient records of our research in order to construct the work that we did, or in order to allow someone else to construct the work that we did. We should mitigate or remove risks of bias. We should honestly report what we did and what we found. And we should know and comply with relevant regulations that might govern our research. For example, if we're working with human subjects, our research plans need to be reviewed by an institution's program which governs work with human subjects to ensure the protection and well-being of those who participate in our research. If we're working with animal subjects, our research plans need to be reviewed by the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee to ensure that we're working with the animals humanely. We have responsibility to other researchers, meaning we should work respectfully and collaboratively with our colleagues. We should always encourage and participate in open inquiry, questioning, discussion, and sharing. We should give credit where credit is due and accept credit only when it's warranted. And we should serve as a mentor to others and seek necessary mentoring for ourselves. Finally, we have a responsibility to society. We should always consider the public interest in the research questions that we ask and in the way that we conduct our research. We should be aware of when research has the potential to be misused in such a way as to pose a significant threat to, for instance, public health and safety or to the environment. And we should strive to bridge the gap between science and the public in the ways that we communicate our work to the public. In other words, here are the common responsibilities we all have to meet and pay attention to. As you might imagine, all of these activities of research and scholarship can present very challenging situations. Let's take a look at some of those challenges. When we think about the collection, use, and interpretation of research data, one of our shared obligations we discussed earlier is to minimize or remove risks of bias. Bias can often be very subtle and perhaps difficult to recognize, especially in ourselves. But bias can influence lots of different arenas. Bias can influence our choice of research focus. Because research is expensive and competition for funding is fierce, research interests of individual scientists might drift toward those topics, methods, and approaches for which support, both financial and political support is more readily available. Bias can show up in the framing of research questions. If you personally believe that X has a serious impact on Y, say gum chewing always causes serious dental decay, you might write your survey question as, many people think gum chewing causes cavities, what do you think? Rather than asking a more neutral, do you find that chewing gum has an effect on your dental health? Other things that might be biased, selection of research participants. Selection bias can happen when participants self-select into a study because of, for instance, an already existing interest in the aims of the study. Selection bias can also happen if you pre-screen your participants in such a way that they don't end up being representative of the entire population. Bias can show up in the collection and selection of research data. How will you select your data? Will you see what you expect to see? You might have a conviction about a particular theory. You might pay attention only to the data that support your desired conclusion and ignore or drop data which doesn't conform. There can be bias in how you interpret and report your research data. If the results are equivocal, what will your interpretation be? Whether you describe the glass as half empty or half full is influenced by what you want your results to look like. Finally, bias can show up in your decisions about how and if to publish. Bias can influence the sharing of results of a study, perhaps as a result of a financial conflict of interest and a need to keep negative findings out of publication. But publication bias is found much more commonly in the accepted practice of only publishing results that show significant findings and not publishing null findings. Bias might be intentional or unintentional, though unintentional bias can be a more serious threat than deliberate misconduct, because the researcher might remain unaware of the ways in which their behavior has been altered. The research and academic systems themselves in which we work might also lead to unintentional bias, as in the case of choosing a research topic or area or question based on funding availability or decisions to not publish null findings. A second responsibility we all have as researchers and scholars is to our research colleagues, and I want to take us back to the expectation that we give credit where credit is due and accept credit only when it's warranted. Credit, in this instance, comes primarily through authorship on research articles, but there can be significant ethical challenges here, primarily because definitions of authorship are not universally accepted or agreed on. What are some of the common authorship concerns? They're fairly basic. The first is, whose name should appear, and in what order? What criteria, if any, are sufficient to justify being an author? What criteria, if any, are absolutely essential to be an author? Who decides? How are disputes resolved in the event that there is a disagreement? And a question that we seldom ask when we're thinking about authorship, but is one of the more important questions, what are the responsibilities of being an author? Answers to all of these questions, in fact, can and do vary from field to field, discipline to discipline, lab to lab, even person to person within a lab. We can't take for granted that our assumptions about the correct answer is shared by others who are asked to answer the same questions. So to decrease the risk of problems, everyone involved in a project should discuss plans and criteria for authorship during the start of any collaboration and continue to discuss as the research project evolves. Finally, we all have a responsibility to pay attention to the relationship between our research and those who might be affected by our research. Let's look at two very different examples of this responsibility. The first example of responsibility to consider the public interest comes from the Facebook study of 2012. In an effort to examine emotional contagion, this idea that emotional states can be transferred to other people, and how that might work in large social online networks, Facebook purposefully manipulated what some of their viewers saw in their news feeds. Almost 700,000 Facebook users were randomly selected and assigned to one of four groups. One group had exposure to a certain random percentage of positive emotional content removed. The other had exposure to a certain random percentage of negative content removed. And the third and fourth groups, the control groups, had a similar proportion of posts completely removed without the consideration of either positive or negative content. After analyzing the results, the researchers did find some effects of the manipulation, but they were minimal. Facebook's users used an average of one less emotional word per 1,000 words over the week following the conclusion of the experiment. The design was sufficient to answer the question, and the question was not a trivial one, given the amount of time people spend interacting with others online. But a significant concern was that none of the Facebook users were aware a research project was being conducted, nor that they were enrolled in that project. This means they didn't have a chance to opt out of participation, nor a chance to make a voluntary and informed decision to participate, an act known as giving consent. These two elements of research with human subjects are considered best practice at a minimum and are actually usually required by an institutional review board before a human subject research project can go forward. However, Facebook believed that the user agreement that people sign when they sign up for a Facebook account covered this manipulation, and that there was a kind of implied consent. Though the researchers, one from Facebook and two from a university, did consult with a university IRB, that IRB determined that no review was required because the research was conducted independently by Facebook, a corporation, and the academic researchers involved were working only with de-identified data that had already been collected and not really working with people or human subjects. No people, no basis for an IRB review. What made this case even more complicated is that the research was intended to manipulate people's emotions, making this, broadly speaking, psychological research with a very real risk of causing psychological harm. One of the core tenets of the ethical regulations that govern research with human subjects is that a researcher must make every effort to maximize benefits and minimize risks. That didn't happen in this case. One of the researchers and a Facebook employee wrote, "At the end of the day, the actual impact on people in the experiment was the minimal amount to statistically detecting it. Having written and designed this experiment myself, I can tell you that our goal was never to upset anyone. In hindsight, the research benefits of the paper may not have justified all of this anxiety." And when we do research with human subjects, that's a primary concern that researchers have, is minimizing the risks while maximizing the benefits. The second example concerns our responsibility to be aware of when research has the potential to be misused in such a way as to pose a significant threat to, for instance, public health and safety, or to the environment, and when those concerns might interfere with the dissemination. Normally, dissemination of our work is expected and a usual part of responsibilities as researchers. An early case involves a botanist. In the early 1940s, Arthur Galston, then a graduate student, found that a particular synthetic chemical, when applied at a specific concentration, could make plants flower faster, which would allow crops to grow in colder climates. At higher concentrations, however, this chemical was extremely toxic, causing defoliation. Galston wrote his research results in his thesis and moved on his career. Galston later learned that military researchers used his and other research to devise chemicals, herbicides, that could be used in wartime, and that the military sprayed tons of these herbicides, primarily one called Agent Orange, on forests and fields in Vietnam, completely destroying them. During the next several years, Galston and a growing number of other scientists opposed the use of these defoliants in the Vietnam War. The use of the defoliants was phased out in 1970, only 5 years before the end of the Vietnam War. Galston had this to say about his work on this material. "I used to think that one could avoid involvement in the antisocial consequences of science simply by not working on any project that might be turned to evil or destructive ends. I have learned that things are not all that simple, and that almost any scientific finding can be perverted or twisted under appropriate societal pressures. In my view, the only recourse for a scientist concerned about the social consequences of his work is to remain involved with it to the end." We don't expect that you enter the university knowing the challenges that are part of being a researcher and a scholar, let alone knowing how to navigate through them. A scholar who has thought a lot about these issues of our responsibility in the academy writes, "Future researchers, like other professionals in the making, need to become acquainted with the kinds of challenges they are likely to face. Without some thoughtful consideration of what their own responsibilities are to be, and an examination of ethical issues that researchers regularly confront, is it reasonable to expect that they will get it right the first time? Surely that places too much faith in instinct or in the general kind of moral guidance that is part of an average upbringing." Taking the time and space for thoughtful consideration is especially important because, though there are shared broad values and responsibilities across disciplines, as we've seen, there are also differences and specifics that we need to learn. Some of the work that we do, like human subjects research or animal subjects research, is regulated by explicit policy and regulations. But other activities that we engage in as researchers and scholars are often guided only by custom or habit, or accepted practice, convention, guidelines, suggestions, general standards. And these can vary significantly between disciplines, or even between labs or research groups in the same discipline. Much of what you need to know and know how to do to make a good decision in your research is learned through personal experience and interactions with other scientists in a particular context. If we don't know the accepted practices in a discipline, we might inadvertently do something unacceptable. If we're not aware of what is considered an ethical standard for a specific field, we might unknowingly do something unethical. It can be confusing to navigate through a situation that might not have clear guidance, or where the guidance doesn't seem applicable, or where people simply don't agree on the best course of action. Most ethical dilemmas are dilemmas precisely because they are ambiguous. They aren't black or white, but gray. These situations can be difficult to navigate through. This is why it's important to talk early and often with advisors, other professors and collaborators, and our peers to ensure we both understand and can meet our ethical obligations. Researchers and scholars who have not been prepared to face possible ethical dilemmas, who haven't had that time and space for thoughtful consideration and examination of the issues, may not have the presence of mind to do the right thing, or even the time to figure out what the right thing is. Explicit and purposeful conversations about the ethical dimensions of research and scholarship encourages and helps researchers and scholars think through ethical problems before they arise, and perhaps have the presence of mind to make a good decision and to do good and ethical work. Thanks for your time, and you should know that there are people at your institution that you can talk with your advisors, talk with your professors, talk with your colleagues. If you're uncertain about anything, ask. You should always feel free to ask questions and seek out any help that you might need. Thank you.